I had kind of a cool experience this week. I was able to speak with Stephen J. Orfield, who is the lead researcher and founder of Orfield Laboratories in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And at these labs, they have the only nationally accredited anechoic chamber in use. And this sounds like nothing to people who don't know what an anechoic chamber is. Essentially, it is a building that they've built, or a room that they've built, that has padding on the walls to such an extent that it absorbs 99.9% of all audio output. So if you're in this room and you talk, it doesn't sound like normal talking, because typically the sound waves go out of your mouth and they bounce around the room. You can kind of hear yourself projected. There's like no ability to project in this room because it absorbs almost all of the noise, and it's labeled the quietest room in the world. And I found this on YouTube a couple years ago. They had an interview with some scientist guy. I just thought it was really interesting, and ever since then I was like, I want to go into that room and see what it's like. I want to experience it for myself, because they've got all these interesting claims about it. They do work with different manufacturers, different companies for a product, like product evaluation. I was talking with him about some of the work they do. For example, what sound should a product make, like a dishwasher make, in order for the customer to trust that it's working and sounds powerful and good? Like what sound association? Because they probably could make it absolutely silent, or they could not mitigate sound at all and not have anything to do with it, and then it would just sound maybe not like something you would trust. And all this somehow plays into the marketing of a product. And so they do testing on products for things like that. What sounds the most trustworthy, the most powerful, the most efficient, whatever. So they do work like that. They also do work with like disabilities, like autism or PTSD. And so I just thought it was a cool thing. And they have claims like people will go, and if you stay in there for a certain amount of time, you can start to hear like your heartbeat and the inner workings of your body. And it kind of freaks people out. They leave feeling a little bit disoriented if they stay in there too long. And there's even thoughts that perhaps staying in there long enough would actually make you somewhat unhinged, like maybe clinically insane just a little bit. That's just a theory. It's just a thought. It's never been attempted or tried. We do have a moral code, I think, in America that seems to still frown on making people clinically insane with testing. So that hasn't happened, but it is thought that that's a potential based on how disoriented people come out of it are. Now, they also just go in for a few minutes and feel incredibly peaceful. I mean, can you imagine completely shutting out as much as you can auditory noise? That would just, shutting down one of your senses completely. It's like a sensory deprivation tank, where you can't feel anything. You're floating in salt water. It's like that, but for your ears. And so I just thought it was cool. It was something interesting that I wanted to try out. And I followed them for a number of years now. And I was reading through their website just kind of by chance, and I saw that on their front page, they list that they've actually experienced seeming miracles while doing some of the testing in their anechoic chamber. And at this, I was like, okay, this might be my in. This is how I need to reach out and see if we can get an interview conducted, because I've already found them interesting. I think other people would too. But now they've got miracle claims. Now we can talk about faith and theology and what constitutes a miracle and the divide between religion and science that seems to be rampant in America right now. So I thought, man, we've got a lot to talk about. This sounds great. I'm going to reach out. Now, after I reached out, they got back to me pretty quickly and were very respectful. But basically, they said, we do a lot of stuff with like major news outlets, and it doesn't really seem like we'd have much to gain from an interview with you. That's fair enough. I don't have the largest follower base or anything, so I didn't understand. But also they were saying, we might consider doing it, but we don't really know what the overlap is. They're thinking like day to day, we do product analysis, and sure, we have seen things that we can't explain through science, but that's like more a trivial fact than it is something to cover on an hour-long podcast. They didn't really see the connection. I pushed back a little bit, saying, I wasn't trying to like profit off of them. I don't make money doing this. I'm just trying to present interesting things to people, and I saw that there was an overlap, so I thought, let's look into it. And so at this, Mr. Orfield was generous and kind enough to give me a call. And he just said, okay, like, let's talk. Let's see what the overlap is. And it turns out I still think there was a decent amount of overlap in the conversation. So who knows? Maybe there's an interview in the future. We'll see about that. But we did have a good conversation on the phone for about an hour. And as it goes with people that just like to talk and find certain things interesting and don't mind religion and science sharing a space in the world, we had a lot to talk about, and it ranged from all kinds of things. It was not just anechoic chamber related. He did go over some of the things that they've experienced miracle-wise, and they related mostly to like PTSD, things being healed that are just like mental states of mind or mental deficiencies that are disabilities that were seemingly removed after having the sensory deprivation. And there's no scientific evidence for like, or no scientific hypothesis as to why it should have happened. And so for those reasons, they can't really document it scientifically and say this works because of X, Y, and Z. And so Mr. Orfield, having a background in faith, sees these things as active miracles that he has record of. So I think that's really interesting. So we did talk about that for a while. But the thing I want to talk to you about today is something else we ended up talking about. We really got into everything. We got into politics. We got into philosophy and history and movies. And it just was kind of an endless conversation that was about all the things that I find really interesting. So I really enjoyed it. But one of the things we talked about was technology and nature and the encroachment of technology on the modern person and how that relates even to things like dementia. I mean, he really listed some terrifying facts about how a lot of dementia patients, we don't really know all the things that might cause dementia, but a lot of it seems to come hand in hand with forms of isolation or forms of deprivation of some of the things that were normal. So lower activity, higher chance of dementia. Lower social interaction, higher chance of dementia. More screen time, higher chance of dementia. And so with this, he's theorized that potentially his grandchildren's generation will be the earliest with onset dementia because of their increased screen time, which isolates them from so many other positive things. And from this, so this was scary enough, but then he said something that I thought, it just made me think a lot about quite a bit of things, but that's what I'm going to cover today. He said something that really surprised me about nature. Now, his first statement I understood completely, and I was familiar with. It was what he said about it that really threw me off, and I want to share it with you because I think there's some really interesting relationship between there's an interesting relationship between what he said and our spiritual lives. What he said was, Micah, nature is severely undervalued in the world. And we talked about why that was a little bit. He said, basically, you've got all these people in the world who recognize that nature is so important and they go out in it and they go to the extremes. I mean, and that's really cool. There's nothing wrong with that. They'll go hike mountains. They'll go scuba dive down deep to the depths of the ocean. They'll go, hike a volcano and climb trees. And what that does is, while it's interesting and beautiful and fulfills a sense of adventure in people, absolutely, and does connect them with nature, when this stuff is put on social media and everybody else sees it, they assume that's what connecting with nature is. In order to connect with nature, I have to do all of those things. And someone who is older or disabled or doesn't find that interesting assumes, okay, I'm not a nature person. And they abandon it altogether because we live in this hyper-polarized society where you either are something or you aren't something. You like something or you don't. And so they do nothing in nature aside from like walk to their cars or whatever. But he was saying that this is a problem because it doesn't need to be all or nothing. You don't need to just like hike into the Grand Canyon or never go outside ever. You can have middle grounds, go into the woods, enjoy time out there. Now, this was something I'd understood. I knew that nature had a positive effect on people. I've even read studies about like just grounding. Like you go outside, put your bare feet in the grass for a few minutes. And I've been trying it for a few months now, and I've noticed positive effects from it. Now, maybe you say it's placebo. I don't know. But there are studies done on it, and it seems that connection in some form with nature, not in some like hippie sense where I'm in tune with it or whatever, but just being outside really does a lot to improve the mental state of people. And it's not just the vitamin D, it's not just the exercise, it is something about being in the presence of nature. And so I knew this, and I knew that it was important, but I asked him, why do you think it's important? And why do you think that we are, like, what do you think the benefits are, and why are we so affected by it? If it's not things like vitamin D, it's not things like exercise, what's your theory? And he said, oh, Mike, it's not a theory. I know. It's the asymmetry. And this threw me off. I was expecting maybe a platitude. I was expecting maybe some answer that I could connect automatically, something that I didn't know myself, but once he said it, it would make perfect sense. But the asymmetry of nature is what benefits us. This was incredibly confusing to me. And so I asked him a little bit more. We talked about it for a while, and I realized what he was saying is that people are so ordered these days, and they've always have been. And this isn't a bad thing, but think about it. Like, if you had a stack of papers on your desk, it would be so natural and so right, and it would just feel right to pick them up and stack them in a nice, neat, precise stack and then set them back down. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's just proof that our mental states are subconsciously obsessed with order. Our schedules have to be just right. And I'm not against precision. I'm not against being on time and being efficient and being punctual. Those are all great and really good and important things. But it just proves the point that we are in some way obsessed with orderliness in our lives. And I think this is a godly thing, actually. I mean, there's so many verses about being orderly and doing things orderly. And, God is not the author of chaos or confusion. He's the author of order. And so it makes sense that we, his creation, would be like this. But, and this is what we talked about as we got into the conversation more, he said, if you go out in the woods and you're just there for a while, your subconscious cannot comprehend the asymmetry of it all. And so it relaxes into it. It can't possibly order things because this is just how things are. If you're in the woods, you can't think, well, I wish there were one tree here and one tree on the other side exactly so it was symmetrical and perfect. You don't do that. Your mind is overwhelmed by the asymmetry, and so that part of you that is obsessed with symmetry and order and precision relaxes and is allowed to just be for a while. The funny thing is, when you leave the woods, and he's done this with several of his friends, he says, that are in the scientific community, he'll leave with his friends and he'll ask them, so how would you have ordered those woods differently? How would you have laid them out? And typically, they don't have an answer for him because they say, well, no, that was fine. There was nothing wrong with the way they were put. There's nothing in your mind clawing at the fact that these need to be precise. These need to be symmetrical. These need to be better. Because we recognize inherently that there is an order to them, and that order is good. Even though to us, order and symmetry are directly related, in God's eyes, in his creation, there is order, but it's just in a slightly different way than we would normally expect it. And I thought this was fascinating, but it led me to think about a verse in 1 Corinthians 14, and it's in verse 40 that I want to talk about. Essentially, Paul is writing to the Corinthian church, and he talks to them about spiritual gifts and about church services. And I guess things must be going a little bit wild there. They clearly had a lot of gifts granted to the church at this time. He talks about tongues and prophecy and all these different things that comes with the receiving of the Holy Spirit. Not to say it's like some magical thing. Perhaps these people already had these gifts and they came into the church as was needed. Perhaps they were granted opportunity to perform these gifts that God had already given them. It really isn't clear, but essentially you've got all these different people willing to serve in different ways with different strengths, and things must have been a little bit chaotic. There's, people speaking in different languages, and sometimes they don't have an interpreter, but they still want to speak. They still want to go share things that they've read from Scripture, things that they understand now. And so there must be a little bit of a chaotic nature to the church at this time. And with all of this, Paul is trying to order things, saying, don't refrain from sharing your gifts, but in verse 39, he says, so my brothers earnestly desire to prophesy, and do not forbid speaking in tongues, but all things should be done decently and in order. So he's advocating for order instead of chaos. Like I said, order is a very good thing. There's nothing wrong with this. However, I'd ask the question, because my church specifically uses this verse a lot to mean that things are done in a very specific way. We have our order of church services. This is what we know. And to deviate from that, unless it's like very well planned out, is to go against this verse of doing things decently and in order. And I think we might be using this verse a little bit out of context. And the proof, I think, is in our understanding of order versus God's understanding of order through nature. Because order does not mean how we like to have it done. Order doesn't mean a precision or a symmetry as we see it. It means not chaos. That's all it means. And so there are a lot of ways for things to go that aren't chaotic, but that might be labeled as disorderly because we don't like them or we're not used to them. Now, I don't think this means we need to go to church and just challenge every status quo and do things so differently that nobody recognizes church services anymore or nobody recognizes how to do things anymore. That's not what I'm advocating for. I just think that we should maybe have a little bit more of an open mind about what order means. It does not mean what I like or what I'm used to or what I prefer. It means not chaos. And so in your church services and your use of this scripture, this is something we should be thinking about because to someone, they might have a sense of order that means precision and timeliness. And this is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But someone else might have a sense of order that matches a little bit more closely to nature, where things aren't symmetrical necessarily. And yet you would leave the woods and never say that they could be laid out any better. And so there needs to be a working together of different types of minds, realizing that order can look different as long as it's not chaotic.